At the end of 2025, China made a move that fundamentally changes how it engages in global trade. Beijing officially passed a revised foreign trade law, with full enforcement scheduled for March 2026, signaling a shift that goes far beyond tariffs or short-term policy adjustments. This revision does not simply adjust trade procedures. It redefines the legal role of trade inside China's economic system. Under the new framework, foreign trade is no longer treated as a neutral, market-driven activity operating on its own logic. It is formally defined as an instrument that must serve national sovereignty, national security, and long-term economic development. The law also strengthens China's legal authority to respond to external economic pressure, giving the government clearer tools to take counteractions when trade conditions are seen as unfavorable. At the same time, it expands state control over exports of sensitive and strategic goods, including materials and components that sit at the center of modern global supply chains. Digital trade rules, green trade standards, and intellectual property protections are also explicitly placed under this state-managed trade framework. Taken together, these changes mean that trade decisions which once followed market incentives can now be guided directly by national priorities written into law. For countries that do business with China, this is not a technical update buried in legal language. For the United States in particular, where many industries remain deeply connected to China-linked supply chains, it represents a structural shift with economic consequences that extend well beyond trade policy. So why did China decide to rewrite the rules of trade at this moment? And why does this legal change have the potential to shake the U.S. economy? To understand that, we need to look at the background that led China to make this choice. Over the past several years, global trade has moved away from open expansion and toward tighter management and protection. Trade is no longer treated as a neutral system that simply connects markets. It has increasingly become a tool that governments actively shape to protect domestic industries and strategic interests. The United States and other major economies have reinforced this shift by tightening technology controls, restructuring supply chains, and expanding policies designed to shield key sectors from external risk. As these measures spread, the traditional framework of multilateral free trade has come under growing pressure. For China, this created a problem of predictability. Trade flows that once felt stable could now be disrupted by sudden rules, restrictions, or regulatory decisions made elsewhere. In response, China chose to anchor its own trade system more firmly in law, aiming to reduce uncertainty by defining how trade would be managed under stress. This approach also reflects China's awareness of higher-level trade standards, including frameworks like CPTPP, which emphasize clearer rules and stronger enforcement. Rather than stepping away from global trade norms, China appears to be reshaping its participation by redefining the rules on its own terms. At the same time, trade frictions remained elevated throughout 2025, with ongoing disputes involving tariffs and non-tariff measures across multiple partners. In that environment, the revised trade law functions as a legal safety net, allowing China to respond quickly when pressure emerges instead of improvising policy after the fact. Against this backdrop, the trade law revision is less about a single dispute and more about preparing for a world where trade conditions can change with little warning. On this foundation, the question becomes clear: how do China's legal changes translate into real economic effects for the United States? One of the clearest paths runs through export controls on strategic and sensitive goods. Under the revised trade law, the Chinese government strengthened its legal authority to control exports based on national priorities. This does not mean a specific country has to be named, or that a formal dispute has to begin. It simply means supply can be adjusted whenever policy priorities change. For American manufacturers, that single shift changes how risk is calculated. Many U.S. industries still depend on raw materials and components that come from China or are controlled by Chinese suppliers. When access to those inputs becomes less predictable, companies start treating supply as a risk, not a given. That risk shows up as added cost. Firms hold more inventory than before, tying up cash just to stay protected. They search for alternative suppliers, which often means higher prices and lower efficiency. They sign longer-term contracts at higher rates to reduce uncertainty. These are not extreme reactions. They are standard business responses when supply reliability can no longer be assumed. Over time, those extra costs spread through the system. Manufacturing becomes more expensive at the company level. Those higher costs are then passed on, either through higher prices for consumers or through tighter margins that limit investment in hiring. In this way, a legal change inside China quietly reshapes cost structures across U.S. manufacturing. And the effect does not end with higher costs. The deeper change is in how companies start planning their future. With China's revised trade law, dispute response and counteraction authority are no longer ad hoc or situational tools. They are now embedded directly into the legal framework that governs foreign trade. This does not point to a specific dispute or an immediate confrontation. It points to a more structural shift. Policy uncertainty itself becomes a constant variable that companies must incorporate into their planning. For U.S. businesses, this alters how risk is assessed at the strategic level. When trade rules can adjust in line with policy priorities, firms become less willing to assume long-term stability. One response is to gradually reduce reliance on any single country, even when existing relationships remain profitable. Another is to design production and sourcing systems that prioritize flexibility and redundancy, not just efficiency. For companies operating inside China, attention increasingly turns toward compliance, monitoring, and internal controls. More management resources are devoted to tracking regulatory signals and preparing for potential rule changes. These decisions are not reactions to a single event or headline. They reflect adaptation to an environment where uncertainty is no longer temporary, but structural. In the short term, this means higher operating and planning costs as safeguards are built into strategy. Over time, it influences broader choices about pricing, hiring, and where future investments are ultimately placed. What matters most is not any individual decision. It is the cumulative effect of many firms adjusting behavior in the same direction. That shift does not remain confined to corporate strategy discussions. It moves outward into the wider economy and eventually becomes something consumers can feel. China continues to play a central role in the supply chains that deliver both consumer goods and intermediate inputs into the United States, and that reality does not change quickly even as trade policies and corporate strategies adjust. As export management, customs procedures, and regulatory oversight become more structured and restrictive, friction tends to appear first at specific stages of the supply chain, where approvals, inspections, and documentation are concentrated, rather than disrupting the entire system at once. These frictions are often uneven and temporary, but they still matter because they change how prices behave. The issue is not whether a specific product suddenly disappears from store shelves. The more important shift is that prices become more sensitive to small disruptions, delays, or changes in availability. For U.S. consumers, this is often felt before any clear or sustained rise in inflation becomes visible. Everyday prices begin to move more frequently, promotions and discounts change more often, delivery timelines become less predictable, and costs fluctuate with less warning than before. Even when overall inflation remains moderate, this kind of price instability affects how households think about spending. Consumers tend to become more cautious when prices feel unpredictable, adjusting purchasing decisions and delaying discretionary spending. Confidence becomes easier to shake, not because prices are always higher, but because they are harder to anticipate. In this way, changes in trade rules do not reach consumers as a single dramatic shock. They appear instead as ongoing price uncertainty that slowly weaves itself into daily economic life. And that leads to a broader question. Is this trade law revision entirely negative for U.S. companies, or does it also create room for adjustment and new opportunities? That question becomes clearer when looking at how the revised law addresses intellectual property, digital trade, and green trade standards. Under the new framework, protections and requirements in these areas are more explicitly defined and more strictly enforced. For U.S. companies, the immediate impact is increased compliance pressure. Documentation requirements expand, certification processes become more detailed, and expectations around data handling and environmental standards grow more demanding. Meeting these standards requires additional time, resources, and coordination across operations. In practical terms, this raises costs and adds complexity to doing business. But that is only part of the picture. Those same rules also bring clearer procedures and more predictable standards. For companies that actively target the Chinese market, this clarity matters. When rules are more formalized, transactions rely less on informal interpretation and more on defined criteria. In digital trade, standardized systems can reduce administrative friction and speed up processing over time. In green trade, clearer benchmarks help firms understand what qualifies and how compliance is assessed. This does not remove risk, and it does not eliminate cost. What it changes is the nature of the trade-off. Companies are no longer choosing simply between access and restriction. They are weighing higher compliance burdens against more transparent operating conditions. In that sense, the revised trade law is neither purely a barrier nor purely an opportunity. It creates a more complex environment where costs and benefits exist side by side. And when all of these structural changes are viewed together, one final question comes into focus. What is the real significance of China's trade law revision for the United States? It becomes clearer when its effects move beyond trade rules and supply chains and into everyday economic life. One of the areas where this shift becomes visible is the labor market. As companies move to reduce dependence on overseas supply in sensitive sectors, manufacturing investment and domestic production can gain support over time. In some regions, this creates new opportunities for industrial jobs and local economic growth. At the same time, the adjustment does not affect everyone evenly. Higher costs and operational changes during the transition can weigh on consumption. When spending slows, sectors closely tied to demand, including retail, logistics, and services, tend to feel pressure first. As a result, the same structural change can create opportunity for some workers while increasing uncertainty for others. But the impact does not stop with jobs. It also changes how trade is discussed and understood inside the United States. As trade becomes more closely associated with security and economic resilience, public attitudes shift. Support for tougher trade positions grows, while caution increases around corporate partnerships, academic exchange, and research collaboration. These changes do not arrive as a single moment or headline event. They build gradually, shaping decisions across business, policy, and society. In this sense, China's trade law revision is not a single event. It represents a structural change in how trade rules and uncertainty coexist within the system. And its effects will increasingly move quietly through the U.S. economy and everyday life.